Stanford University.
She's got another one, so there you go. Next week we have Ed Chi, who's been doing some interesting work on social recommender systems at Park. And today we have Nikki Kittur, who's assistant professor at CMU's HCI Institute. And Nikki did his PhD in cognitive psychology at UCLA and his undergrad at Princeton. And I think it was a dual major in psychology and computer science. Is that correct? That's it. Welcome.
Thanks. Let's see, do I need to do anything with this?
No.
Is this okay? Good. Okay, so thanks for having me today, and thanks for the great turnout. I like to start my talks with a large number. So this is a large number. This is the number of bytes that were created on the internet in 2002. And this number has been growing at about 30% a year since then, right? So to give you some kind of perspective on this, this is about 37,000 Library of Congresses. Or if you take the number of words that have ever been spoken by any human who has ever lived and you added them together, this is about the same order of magnitude, right? So an enormous amount of information, enormous amount of possibilities. Think about scientists who can collaborate on giant data sets all around the world, or you can learn about any topic you want with the click of a button, right? But in order to make use of this information, we have to make sense of it. And while the human mind is tremendously powerful and flexible in terms of how deeply we can process information, we're very limited in terms of how much we can process at once, right? So here's another number. This one's a little bit smaller, and this is about this is an estimate of how much we can hold in our heads at one time, right? So about 7 chunks. And since then, estimates actually put us closer to about 4 chunks that we can hold and manipulate in our memories at once. So we're clearly on a slippery slope here, right? This is 4 chunks of essentially variables that we can manipulate in our heads. So think about working memory. How many things can you, phone numbers, these, those kinds of things. How do you manipulate them? Right? And so let's take an example that a lot of you can probably relate to. If you're a graduate student and you want to learn about some new area of literature that you haven't learned about before, right? There's a lot of different tasks that you need to engage in. And they range from finding the relevant literature, from filtering that to see kind of what is actually relevant to you, to actually reading and understanding that and building a mental model of it, to integrating that into something that's cohesive, and deciding, what are you actually going to do with this, right? And these kinds of tasks are things that we do in our daily lives for everything from buying a digital camera to kind of making sense of your symptoms as a patient. And this is really what lies at the heart of my research, is how do we help people make sense of overwhelming amounts of information? And I have kind of 3 different approaches. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them today. On the one side, what are the individual cognitive processes that enable us to make sense of information? Categorization, memory. At the group level, how do we combine many minds together to process information and make sense of it in a way that exceeds any individual's capabilities? And how do we support those with machine tools like visualization and machine learning? Okay, so today I'm going to focus kind of on the group side and a little bit on the machine side, and especially in the context of 2 systems that we've been doing a lot of work on, Wikipedia and Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So before I get there, let me kind of start a little bit higher level. Recently we've seen a lot of growth in large-scale social collaboration on the internet, and this really provides us with a lot of different advantages. So there's at least 3 key advantages. One is that we can solve problems that are too large for any individual to solve. Right? We can build on each other's work, and we can do things like create the largest encyclopedia ever in human history. Another advantage is that the work of individuals can benefit the group. So think about something, if you've seen Delicious, you tag web pages, you bookmark them for yourself, but that by aggregating the tags of everyone together, we now have a way of organizing all of our web content and navigating through it. And the last one is this idea that aggregating a lot of decisions made by a lot of different people can lead to better outcomes than even experts could come up with. And this is commonly known as the wisdom of crowds, right? So the wisdom of crowds is not something new. Sir Francis Galton, back in about 1903, went to a county fair, and after eating his cotton candy, he came across this contest in which people were asked to judge the weight of an ox. And he collected all of the pieces of paper on which people had written down their guesses and basically averaged those together and found that he could estimate the weight of the ox better than experts. Apparently back then there were experts who judged the weight of oxen. But he found he could come remarkably close to approximating that. And the internet has made these kinds of wisdom of crowds much easier, right? So think about things like the Iowa electronic market, which has done a remarkably good job of predicting the winners of our presidential elections, of our Congress elections. Sites like Dig and Reddit, where people are filtering our news and the way that we consume information is being kind of filtered by each other. Delicious, where we're organizing web pages. Movies, products, where we're recommending things to each other based on our experiences and our purchases. Now, what all of the things that I've just talked about share in common are two assumptions, right? One is that we want to get people to make independent judgments, right? So they're not talking to each other, they're not discussing things, they're making kind of independent judgments, and we have some way of automatically aggregating those judgments, right? So we can put those together. If we're judging the weight of an ox, we can just average those, but there's kind of more sophisticated ways of doing that. This works for a lot of different tasks and is quite powerful, as we've seen here so far, but for a lot of more complex sense-making tasks, these assumptions aren't enough, right? So think about scientists who are collaborating on a new discovery. You can't just automatically aggregate their judgments, right? They need to kind of discuss, to collaborate with each other. Think about detectives who may be tracking a serial killer, or, as we'll talk about more, volunteers writing an encyclopedia. These are kind of complex tasks. You need to coordinate. You need to do things like plan, communicate with each other. And in a lot of these tasks, coordination is really the norm. It's not the exception, right? So the question that I'm going to talk about today is, how do we harness the power of the crowd for these types of complex sense-making tasks? And the first domain I'm going to talk about is Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is one of the most popular websites in the world. It's always, it's been ranked in the top 10 most popular websites for years now. And it has over 2 million articles in the English version alone, over 6 million registered user accounts. And there's a lot of good reasons why we would want to study Wikipedia as an example of a system of complex tasks. So you can have thousands of individuals who are engaged in sense-making on a single article. A single article can have thousands of people who all have different points of view, who all have different expertise and information available to them. And so somehow we need to integrate that information into a cohesive artifact, right? And a lot of these artifacts, these articles, require a high degree of coordination. So think about what you have to do if you're writing an article, right? So if we were all writing an article together, we need to decide, let's say we're writing an article about Stanford University, right? We need to decide, okay, what's going to go in the article? What's the scope of the article? Are we going to talk about this, the Hewlett-Packard Auditorium? Is that noteworthy enough to go in there? We have to organize and structure all of that content. We need to actually generate that content. And we need to resolve conflicts, so we might all have different ideas on what should happen. So the nice thing about Wikipedia is that people are doing this kind of activity all the time, and all of their contributions are available to us, right? So every edit, every kind of comment, every discussion, is publicly available. It's now actually more than doubled that, but if you have a large enough hard drive, you can go and download that yourself, in theory, right? And so we actually had to use things like the Yahoo cluster to make this kind of reasonable in terms of time, but in theory, anyone can do this. So let me just take you through a very quick tour of Wikipedia, kind of a behind-the-scenes tour. How many people here have actually edited Wikipedia? Okay, so quite a few. How many people here have read Wikipedia? Okay, good. It's kind of a trick question nowadays. So this is kind of what you would see as a reader in Wikipedia, right? So this is the article for the music of Italy, kind of the text that you would see. But notice along the top there are different tabs, right? So most people who come and see read Wikipedia just see this tab. But if you look over in the discussion tab, there's actually a lot of information here. There are people who've said kind of how people have rated this article. It's actually a good article class article. It's very important article to have here. It's part of various wiki projects, which are kind of projects within Wikipedia. If you scroll down, you see that there are people talking to each other. So there's a user named JeffMatt who says, okay, I adjusted this section by shifting a few sentences so that we get a smoother flow from the lead in the lead section, right? And then another user named ToughCat, I don't know how they come up with their names, but ToughCat says, okay, yeah, that looks good. I'm also fine with adding a paragraph on film music, but I'm not entirely sure I agree with the placement, right? So they're communicating with each other. They're discussing and negotiating what this article should become. And it turns out that if you add up all of the kind of talk page edits, if you add up all of the talk page content, it's and all of the non-article content, it actually is greater than all of the articles themselves, right? So the articles that you see on Wikipedia are really, in some sense, the tip of the iceberg. And all of this coordination and communication is what's going on underneath the surface. So you can see some of that in the edit history. So this is another one of the tabs is the edit history of the page, and you can see that there are people here who are reverting each other, right? So there's a anonymous editor who made an edit, and you can see the edit above them. ToughCat reverted those edits, right? So people are coming in here and reverting vandalism and reverting people they don't agree with as well, right? So what I'm going to talk about here a little bit is what makes Wikipedia successful. So I kind of brought up this wisdom of crowds idea, right? And the idea there is the more people you get on the page, coming to the page, you should get more content. You should get more people catching errors. If you've heard of Linus's law of kind of any bug is shallow, the more eyeballs that sees it. So there should be a lot of advantages that we get from having more people come and participate. And we're not actually the first people to look at this. So in a very nice study in 2007, Dan Wilkinson and Bernardo Huberman looked at what makes an article featured in Wikipedia. Now, in Wikipedia, there are these featured articles, and they're kind of they're the cream of the crop, right? They've actually gone through strict peer review, and they've been rated by the community as kind of the best articles. And so they wanted to see what makes these articles different from all of the other articles, right? And so what they found is that controlling for page rank, which they're essentially trying to control for the popularity of kind of that topic, they found that featured articles, which are in red here, tend to have more edits, and they also have more people working on them, more editors, than non-featured articles, which are in black, right? And so this supports this idea of the wisdom of crowds in some sense, right? The more people, the more work you have, the better the outcome appears to be. Now, there are a few questions with this that you might raise, right? So one issue is that this is a cross-sectional analysis. So what that means is there could be a reverse causation problem. So imagine that, instead of people driving the quality of these articles. Maybe people are attracted to articles that have already become featured, right? So you have this reverse causation. Course quality metrics, so actually fewer than 2,000 of all of those 2 million articles I told you about have been featured. So maybe there's something different going on for all of the other articles. And what I'm going to be most interested in talking about here is actually the coordination. So what is the role of coordination in driving the quality of Wikipedia articles? Now, coordination is a good thing, right? But it has costs. So as we've known for kind of a very long time, increasing the number of contributors incurs process loss. So if you've ever been to a meeting, if you've ever been on a project team where more and more people have been added, you kind of intuitively know this, right? But think about it in this way. One way of thinking about it is you get diminishing returns the more people that you add to a project. And one way to think about that is that you are kind of adding a linear amount of work with each new person, but each new person superlinearly increases the number of pairs that potentially need to communicate with each other. And so in the extreme, you get what Fred Brooks said as adding manpower to a late software project makes it later, right? And so what this suggests is that the more you can support coordination, the more benefits you should get, in theory, from adding more people. So let's look at coordination. How much coordination and communication is there in Wikipedia? And if you look at it, the effects are actually quite striking. So back when Wikipedia started, almost 100% of all of the work went to the article itself. That Music of Italy article that we saw there, almost all of the work people are doing on changing and editing that article. Since then, and these numbers are about where they are now, about only 70% of all of the work goes to the article. So you have a third of all of the work in Wikipedia that's going to something that most people in the world don't actually see, right? And so what are they doing? They're talking on that discussion page that I showed you. They have user pages for themselves where they're discussing what should be done and negotiating with each other there. In that other bucket, a lot of that are these projects, these wiki projects, which have evolved. And they're kind of domain-specific projects. So they might be interested in military history, or they might be interested in biology. And they've evolved as kind of hubs for coordination within these people. Yeah, Steve.
These are sort of the relative amounts of work done on each of those tasks. What about the absolute amount of work? I assume that goes up.
Oh, well, that's
these years.
That's actually a really interesting question, because for the years that I'm showing you, the absolute amount of work has been growing exponentially, right? So just tremendous increase in the amount of work. Around 2007 or so, actually people down the road, Ed Chi and Bongwon Suh, found that there was a dramatic dip in the absolute contributions to Wikipedia, such that now Wikipedia is at best a steady state in terms of people coming in versus people going out. And so now we're really seeing problems with kind of newcomers who are coming in. They get kind of faced with, they have to deal with all of this stuff, right? All of this coordination and communication that's happened. They need to know about it before they can contribute to the article in an effective way. And so it's created a real barrier, a real bureaucracy that is having kind of this remarkable effect, and kind of Wikipedia is very aware of this and very concerned about it. And we, among other people, are trying to build tools to make that process of kind of sense making for the contributor easier. So yeah, this is kind of relative, but the absolute story is in some ways a scary one now. Yeah. Yeah.
Wouldn't this also have a lot to do with the fact that as more and more articles are made, there's less and less articles to be made, so therefore more time has to be spent just improving the articles rather than making new ones?
Yeah, so that's another kind of possibility, and the suggestion is that maybe there's less to write about.
Especially like if you're just getting to the point where all the articles are written and you're just down to tuning it, then tuning is necessarily like
right. So that is another possibility. It turns out though that a huge portion of articles on Wikipedia are stubs. So there's kind of very tiny content. So even though the topic has been created, there's actually very little work done. So if you were to randomly choose kind of arbitrarily an article from Wikipedia, you're much more likely than not to get only a single sentence or paragraph. Yeah?
Is the amount of translational work going up? You can imagine that if we'll call the English language Wikipedia pretty good, one appealing next step would be to say, okay, every crowd, let's translate this to all the world's other languages.
Right. Yeah, so the amount of translation is going up. And it's a little more subtle than that, though. So people are working on tools to kind of help with that translation piece. There are norms in the community that don't always align with that, though. So in some Wikipedia communities, you get people who feel, well, why should we copy what the English Wikipedia has? It's already there. It's already good. We want to have kind of our own unique perspective on this. And so there are some nuances to it, but I think there is still a lot of potential for taking this information and translating it. Yeah. Question? Okay. So, just to show you that this isn't just in Wikipedia, right? What if Wikipedia is kind of a unique case? In a lot of ways it is, because it's by far the most popular wiki. There's actually, does anyone know the second most popular wiki in the world? World of Warcraft? Count it in one. World of Warcraft wiki is actually the second most popular wiki in the world. And we actually looked at a set of about 7,000 wikis, including the World of Warcraft wiki, and we find that we see very similar patterns in terms of coordination growth that mirror Wikipedia, both kind of relatively and in terms of absolute numbers, which is quite remarkable. So I only bring this up to kind of point out that maybe Wikipedia is not kind of unique, and that we do need to study kind of a lot of other systems before we can generalize some of what we're saying, but the opportunities are out there. Okay, so there's a long history, in organizational behavior that talks about, what are the different kinds of coordination, and so that we can try to understand what is really going to impact quality, what's going to scale up to kind of the thousands, the millions of users that we see in pure production systems like Wikipedia. And generally, there have been kind of two types of coordination that are talked about. So one is explicit coordination. So think about this as what we saw on that talk page. People directly communicating with each other, negotiating what should be done, who's going to work on what, right? So, things like, planning, what are the steps forward we need to have? What kind of coverage do we need? And, how does the readability of this section work? But there's another kind of coordination which people have talked about as more implicit coordination. And this is much more around division of labor. How do we structure our group so that it works kind of optimally, right? So you can imagine one example would be, okay, let's say if we're all working on this article, maybe we need some core group of leaders who's going to create some structure so that we can all go out and participate more effectively, right? Now, the advantage of implicit communication and coordination is that it avoids some of the overhead of having to talk to each other, right? And so it might scale better than explicit coordination does. So let me just show you an example of how this actually played out in the Music of Italy article. This is just a graph of the contributions. Early on, Tough Cat was actually generated most of the article, him or herself. And after that, the article was filled in by a lot of contributors. So Tough Cat created a skeleton, which other contributors came in and fleshed out. But at the end of this period, the article was in dire need of reorganization. And the other user, Jeff Matt, came in, and by reorganizing this, he didn't work in a vacuum, but by reorganizing it primarily himself, he avoided a lot of the coordination overhead that would have happened if, say, a team of us or if all of us were to come together and try to decide what the new organization should be. So what I'm going to show you now is a study looking at what factors predict improved quality of articles in Wikipedia, right? Trying to get at what makes Wikipedia succeed. And I'm going to look at these three factors. Number one, adding editors. Number two, explicit coordination. So there we're going to look at how many edits to the talk page are there. And I'll talk in a second about implicit coordination. But before we can do that, we need some way of defining quality, right? Like how do we determine whether a page has gone up in quality? Now, the nice thing is that Wikipedia has come to our rescue in some sense. There's these projects that I was telling you about. One of their activities is to assess articles for what quality level there are. There have been, now this is an old number, there have been well over 1 million assessments of articles made in Wikipedia, and they're assessed into 6 different levels of quality, and the top 3 are peer-reviewed, so you can't just kind of go say, oh, I'm going to make this a featured article. It has to go through a long process in order for it to get there. And we actually did some assessment with non-expert judges, so non-Wikipedians, and found that this quality scale seems to actually have some external validity. So this is nice, right? We have a bunch of ratings. We know when articles have changed from one level to the other. So we still need kind of coordination measures. So again, explicit coordination, we're looking at how much people are talking to each other. Implicit coordination, we used the concentration of editing amongst people. So let me give you the intuition for that. Question?
Such sort of things which people can collaborate on and they'll become better. But right now, it's basically taste, right? Whether people think this article is good, whether or not, there's sort of a general consensus of whether something on Dig is valuable. But you started off by talking about a fact, people estimating a measurement, which is a fact of the world. So are there things which the wisdom or the intelligence of a crowd isn't helpful? It doesn't matter if you throw more people at the problem? Or can anything be improved in this way?
Well,
Can you just summarize it so I couldn't hear what you said?
I'm not sure I got the entire question, but does the wisdom, is the wisdom of the crowd always kind of a good thing? Are there situations where the wisdom of the crowd kind of doesn't work? Is that kind of, okay. So there's a long answer to that question, and there's actually a lot of really interesting cases in which it does fail, right? So you can think of simple things like biases, right? If you get a bunch of people who are kind of prejudiced against, say, women, then you're not going to get the wisdom of the crowds, right? You can get cascades, like information cascades, where you see things like the stock market bubbles then bursts, right? And in this case, I'll actually show you, let's hold that for a few more slides, but that comes exactly into play here too. So implicit coordination, concentration of editing amongst editors, right? So let me give you the intuition here. So if we have an article that has 100 edits and there are 10 people who edit it, could be that everyone is making 10 edits, right? Or it could be that there's one person who's doing all the work and everyone else is just making an edit or two, right? So how do we characterize this? So we used the Gini coefficient, which is commonly used in sociology and economics to do things like measure the disparity of wealth in countries, right? So a country like Switzerland has a fairly even kind of distribution of wealth, where kind of other countries, and for example the US, actually have a fairly big disparity in terms of wealth distribution, right? So Gini near 0 means it's evenly distributed, 1 means it's fairly concentrated. I'm not going to go into the gory details, but things to take away from this is that we can do some nice things in terms of being able to make stronger causal claims, being able to control for kind of popularity and topic, being able to control for self-selection factors by using some methods, and you can kind of look at our paper for more details. I'm going to give you the intuition for the analysis, which is this. You take an article at some point in time. The article is at some level of quality. Let's say it's a B-class article, right? And there's some control factors we can look at. Now, something happens to this article. Let's say 6 months go by, right? And either a lot of people work on it or not. Could be that they talk to each other a lot or they don't. Could be that kind of the work is concentrated, so you have this core group of leaders, or it's evenly distributed. And at the end of that time, the article has either improved in class or it hasn't, right? So what we're trying to do is predict when an article improves based on these different factors, okay? And what we found was actually quite surprising. So we went into this thinking, okay, the wisdom of crowds is probably, it seems likely to help in a lot of different regards, and we expected coordination to have an impact beyond that. But what we found was actually very different. So overall, it turns out that adding more people, holding everything else constant, doesn't seem to increase the quality of an article, right? Whereas kind of these other methods of coordinating do seem to have a positive impact, right? So let's look at this in a little more detail because it's more interesting than just that, right? It turns out that it depends on the way that people coordinate. So here's what happens if people, about communication, people talking to each other. So let me just explain this graph. So we have the predicted change in quality along the y-axis, and we have the number of editors in log scale along the x-axis. And what you can see here is for when you have high communication between editors, you have an advantage over low communication, but that advantage quickly goes away. So when you have somewhere between 30 and 40 editors, you no longer have an advantage for having those people talk to each other a lot. And you can probably imagine why, right? So, it's not so efficient if we all wanted to write an article to have us all talking to each other all at the same time, whereas if you have a smaller group, maybe it is more effective, right? But look at what happens for concentration. We see exactly the opposite pattern. So you see an advantage for concentration even for a small number of editors, but that advantage actually increases the more people you have. So what this is saying is that concentration, having a small core of leaders who are enabling everyone else, who's working less, who are maybe less, contributing less, seems to be a way that scales to a large group of people. So we seem to be able to harness kind of the power of the crowd by using this method.
It seems to be arguing for hierarchy. Like it helps to have leaders, it helps to have coordinators who are helping to manage the crowd.
So what's interesting about the Wikipedia dynamic is that, that's exactly what it suggests, but what happens is that there is not this direct hierarchy in the system. Everyone is essentially the same in the sense that you can't order someone else to do something. You don't have some explicit kind of rank above someone else. So in some sense it's these peers who are banding together in a way that kind of helps drive others who might not be contributing, but they're not kind of ordering each other to do things. So some people are administrators, but those people don't tend to exert, they don't exert their influence through kind of managerial control in that sense. They're able to do extra things like blocking vandals or preventing a page from being edited again. Now there is kind of, it's an interesting distinction because there is kind of a bit of a culture where people who edit more tend to be able to do more, right? So actually at lunch I was telling about this quote from an admin that we surveyed who said that, your effectiveness in Wikipedia is dependent on how well you can quote policy and precedent, right? And so, it's this sense that if you are kind of around longer, maybe you can get your point of view through more, but it's probably not through kind of direct management of rank or hierarchy. It's probably more through these other kinds of processes. Yeah, but it's really interesting, right? We have this system that is not kind of managerially controlled in that sense, but we are seeing these advantages of having what you might, in some sense, call a hierarchy. Yeah.
So does concentration, is that, I'm thinking Gini coefficient. So I'm interpreting high concentration to be Gini coefficient close to 1. Am I interpreting that right? Mm-hmm. And so in that case, what it looks to me is that the high bar is almost flat. And so what that says to me is if you've got one person who is super dedicated and does most of the work, then the quality is quite high. But if you have a lot of people sort of fiddling around, that gives you a much smaller benefit. Is that the right interpretation?
That's part of it. Yeah, so having fewer people has this advantage, right? Especially if they're driving most of the work. What I'm not showing you here is actually some work we did with conflict, which I'll talk about in a second, where I don't have a slide for that, but I do have part of that, where if you have fewer people, it's also much more likely that you'll get into, you'll have conflict on the page, and that will lead to kind of worse quality. So we find an association with worse quality. So it's a little bit more nuanced, and when you actually look at what these people are doing on the page, just like I showed with kind of Tough Cat and Jeff Matt, it isn't just that they're kind of contributing more and doing everything on the page. It's that they're kind of making it easier for other people to contribute as well. And when we control for things like the quality of their work on other pages, we still see this effect. Yeah?
I wonder too about anything you can speak to about the difference of a real-life collaboration versus things you're seeing on Wikipedia. For example, in a work collaboration, one person will write the draft, and then a committee may provide edits or feedback, but then that one person goes back and edits it. And I think the model's not too dissimilar from what you're describing. Are you noticing differences online that happen, you don't think, in real life?
Yeah, I mean, the way that these, so if you were to take that kind of model and apply it to Wikipedia, what you might expect is kind of someone would write the article, someone else would come in and provide some feedback, and et cetera. What you see is a much more organic process of some content will be added to the article. Someone else will come in, massage that content, make it a little bit better. Someone else will come in and notice it has missing citations. Someone else will come in and fix those citations. So it's actually kind of an open question as to how closely does that model fit with kind of other models of collaboration offline. But it certainly doesn't seem to be always the same people who are doing kind of everything every step of the way. Some parts of it, though, do seem to be much closer to the offline model. So when the article becomes very high quality and it goes through kind of a peer review process, we found that it tends to be kind of a small group of people, or even one person in some case, who drive making all of the changes that people suggest. So in that case, it certainly seems to be more of the offline kind of collaboration. When you start the article off, I think you see it being much more organic growth. So there's something interesting about the dynamics of how the article evolves that probably does change in that regard. Yeah. Okay. So takeaways from this part, we've shown that Wikipedia has a huge amount of coordination that's going on, and this coordination is really driving, it's not just how many people you have, it's how well they coordinate. And it's not just how well they coordinate, it's the type of coordination that they use, right? So communication, just talking to each other, didn't seem to scale up as well as concentration did to very large groups of people. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of briefly talk about some of our work moving from kind of analyzing these systems to how do we make these systems more effective. One of the problems that also happens to be one of the reasons why Wikipedia has succeeded is that anyone can contribute anything, right? And it turns out that we have a fun study looking at what will make people trust Wikipedia more, which I don't have time to tell you about, except that we asked a bunch of people, what will make you trust Wikipedia more? And they all gave us exactly the same, probably 90% gave us the exact same answer. So guesses as to what would make you trust Wikipedia more. So who the editors were? Nope. That's what we thought. Yep.
Range of perspectives.
Yep, that would make sense too, but nope. Any other guesses?
Ranking.
Ranking, that also would make sense, but that wasn't it. I mean, 90+% of people gave us the same answer.
Does an expert agree with this?
What?
Does an expert agree with this? Would an expert sign
That
off?
would also. That's also what we predicted. And
How about nothing?
what?
How about nothing?
That's exactly the answer, right? So 90% of people said no. There's nothing that can make me trust Wikipedia more. No, it was not because they trusted Wikipedia. And in that study, we've shown kind of that giving people some of these things that you've brought up, knowing who the editors are, kind of providing some more information around the context of the article actually does change their opinions quite a lot. So even though they say that, there is room for us as researchers. What I'm going to talk about here is actually the flip side of that, which is conflict, right? So you have a lot of people, they all have different points of views, you're likely to get conflict. And so how do we predict conflict, and how do we find some way of showing that? So again, Wikipedia comes to our aid in having at least one way of measuring conflict, which is that people tag articles as being controversial when there's kind of a lot of argument going on in them. And so what you can do as our operational measure of conflict, we just looked at all of the revisions of an article, and we counted up how many of these revisions is this article in conflict for, right? And this is kind of its conflict score. And what we wanted to do is predict that conflict score based on various metrics that we can compute easily for all articles in Wikipedia. Things like how many revisions does it have on the article page, on the talk page, the length, how many editors are working on it, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of to make a long story short, we found that we can do a pretty reasonable job of training a machine learner on what kinds of articles are likely to be in conflict. Right? And so you can see that there's kind of an outlier up at the very top there, right? And so first I'll say that this works even without the outlier. But when I saw that outlier, I was like, okay, this was a little while ago, so it was like, okay, is this the Iraq War, or is this about abortion or religion? Any guesses as to what that outlier? Sarah Palin? No, good guess. George Bush, yes. So the most controversial page in Wikipedia is actually George Bush. In this case, actually helping us, so that's great. Again, this works without that. So we trained the model kind of using the relatively small set of articles that were labeled as in conflict. But there's a lot more articles out in Wikipedia, and what you want to do is be able to extend it. So we took the model, applied it to a stratified sample of all Wikipedia articles, and then we had them rated by expert administrators. And what we found is that we can do a pretty good job we have a significant positive correlation between the experts and the predicted scores. And again, here you can see some outliers up top. Any guesses as to those outliers? Why would you mess up? So this one's actually a little bit trickier. So it turns out one of those is, if I give you this clue, you'll probably get it. One of those was about the Atlantic hurricane season that year, right? And so what was happening is that these current events articles would keep getting updated very, very frequently in a pattern that made kind of the model think that it was an article in high conflict. So it doesn't work for everything, but it does seem to do at least a reasonable job. Here are some of the interesting, here are the top weighted features. Some of them are relatively obvious, so if people are kind of talking more revisions on the talk page, that would probably be a symptom of conflict. But some of these are kind of interesting, right? So this actually gets back to the question of how many people are working on the page. So the number of unique editors, the fewer editors you have, the more conflict you're likely to have. And you can imagine that's because these people are kind of butting heads against each other. And what we do see is that when you have more editors, you get mediators who are coming in to diffuse some of that conflict. Okay, so now we can do a reasonable job of predicting.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could be different opposite effects on anonymous edits in the talk page and the article page. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so that's another really interesting difference, right? So there's been a lot of debate about how useful is it for Wikipedia to have anonymous editors involved, right? A lot of them turn out to be vandals. So what this is saying is that actually these anonymous editors contributing to the articles don't seem to be increasing conflict, maybe even might be reducing conflict. But when they start talking to kind of the other editors, they start getting involved in those debates, it actually leads to more conflict. So maybe being anonymous during the kind of communication negotiation process, maybe that isn't kind of as useful, but these people do seem to be doing useful work for the article. Yeah?
What's the intuition that anonymous editors are or decrease conflict? Is that something causal, or is
I'm not sure that, yeah, I'm not sure how far to push this. I think the features at the top are much more highly weighted. Yeah, I'm not sure I have as good an explanation for this particular one, whether it's really decreasing conflict or not. Yeah.
So does that correlate to the kind of edit, if it's like fixing a typo or repaginating or something like that, as opposed to actually changing content?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're actually looking at that issue now. So it's much harder to do that because you need to code kind of all of the edits on a page, right? And there are thousands and thousands of them. And you want to do this across a lot of pages. So we've actually finally gotten training data to do that, and we want to kind of investigate those issues. But I don't have an answer.
Can you even intuitively do it just by size of edit, like if it's 2 or 3 characters or something that indicates typo as opposed to content change?
Yeah, somewhat, but it gets a lot more complicated, especially when you're trying to look at things like, okay, is this like restructuring it? Is this kind of fixing the flow? Is this, and so it gets more complex. I can tell you that people who spend more time in Wikipedia, who are more experienced, tend to make more substantive edits than people who don't. And so you would imagine these anonymous editors are making kind of smaller edits of that. Yeah?
Are undos a feature over here, or do they find the revisions of the article?
Sorry?
Are undos a feature?
Reverts, right. So reverts are, let me see if we, yeah, so we did use reverts in the future. Surprisingly, it didn't come up here, but yeah. Okay, so how long do we have until today?
2:05?
2:05, okay. So,
Keep talking.
all right, I can keep talking. So how do we actually help people make sense of these conflicts that are happening? Because what you often see is that it's not just a conflict between one person and another. You often see these factions of people who gang up on each other, right, to promote their point of view. So what we did, we just took a very simple approach where here's the intuition. Let's say that Stephen and I both started reverting Jeff, right? Now, what is likely is that we probably have views that are more in common with each other than we do with Jeff, right? Because we're both reverting him. And so imagine, all we did was, basically did a visualization where nodes repel each other if they revert each other and otherwise attract each other. And what you can see are some interesting kind of groupings that come up from that. So this is the Terry Schiavo page from a little while back. What you can see here is that if you look at the content, we have clusters corresponding to people who are writing who we can tell are sympathetic to the husband or to the parents. We get kind of a group of mediators. The people in green are admins who are trying to kind of mediate between them, and kind of anonymous vandals or jerks who everyone is reverting. We see, this is another good example. This was actually an island in the Pacific that's either called Dokdo or Takashima, depending on if you're Korean or Japanese. It's in dispute between the two different countries. And if you basically look at the different viewpoints by these groups, they correspond. But if you also look at their geolocated IP addresses, they also correspond to kind of the countries, right? So even these kind of very simple ways of trying to show different factions that are in conflict seem to get us reasonably far, right?
So in both of these, there seems like there's a lot of vandals.
Yes, which there are.
In either side.
Which there are in kind of a lot of these articles. It's quite remarkable. Once the article is matured to a certain level, it seems to become a vandal magnet. So there's a whole set of work in vandalism, which is interesting, but yeah. Okay, so I brought that up in part to talk about, just to kind of pitch this new project that we're working on called Wikipedia Labs, where we're building a live mirror of Wikipedia, which we can implement our own controlled experiments of interfaces like the ones that I've just shown you on. And with the kind of partnership of the Wikimedia Foundation, who's going to be driving traffic to us, we can actually test kind of experimentally, how effective are these types of interfaces? How, can we show them things like what you've all talked about? Will that help people in trusting Wikipedia more? Will that help people in becoming new contributors and making sense of that 30% of coordination stuff that's happened before, right? And so, we're starting this kind of this year, but in future years, we'll be looking for people who have interfaces that they want to test on the system. And so keep that in mind kind of as time goes on. Okay, so I'm going to switch into the second half of my talk. Yeah, question?
Have you looked at how article quality correlates with conflict? So, for example, could you create a new article that very obviously takes a position that's contentious in order to get people to engage in contributing to that article, or to do something even simpler where you introduce a lot of spelling errors into an article to get people to engage and hopefully write more in depth?
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of interesting kind of points in there. One is that what's the relationship between conflict and quality? And we've looked at that a little bit. Overall, it looks like conflict is associated with lower quality, which is also kind of reflected in the organizational literature. But it's very possible that certain kinds of conflict are actually productive. And so the examples that you gave are kind of some examples where you might imagine creating productive conflict. So that's one area that we want to kind of look at. Another thing that sort of brings up is the idea that you want to give people hooks to come in and fix things, right? And in the open source world, that actually works through things like bug reports. People start making bug reports, then they transition into contributing code to fix those reports, then they transition into actually becoming kind of core contributors of the project. Can we do something similar for Wikipedia? And I think that's another thing that we're interested in. Yeah.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll bring that up. I found some examples in Wikipedia that topic of technical nature, math, whatever. And there was a long discussion in the back by accident I found, by digging down, that the two of the editors are actually software engineers. And they came to the conclusion on this particular topic they would have loved to apply software engineering techniques. Yes, it's a bigger overhead, but to maintain that topic, that would have been much easier on them overall. And even more importantly, at higher quality.
Right. Right. And I think
yes, it would have been an overhead, but there is a cross correlation there, obviously.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about. I think there's no doubt that if we were to add processes, we could get improved quality. But we do have to weigh that against. These are volunteers who are coming in. They don't have much time.
They absolutely said that for a beginner. I mean, somebody is not trained in those tools.
Yeah.
It makes no sense whatsoever. The overhead is simply too high.
Right. So
for an expert, it was really, they recommended it.
Right. So one of my collaborators, Bob Kraut at CMU, it actually just launched a project trying to get the American Psychological Society, people from there to come in and edit Wikipedia articles on psychology and to kind of use, to test kind of what processes will lead them to kind of edit more effectively. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity for that, and testing that experimentally will be really interesting. Yeah. Okay, one more. Yeah.
So one avenue that might be interesting to explore is, so the challenge with doing online, these online studies is that they're very useful, but one is you can see correlation but not necessarily causation. And second is because the study is only of Wikipedia, the question is does it only apply to Wikipedia? And one interesting thing is to take correlative observations from this and replicate them in lab experiments across different platforms. So you can imagine this observation of conflict versus quality and the people in the lab seed them to have, prime them to have conflict, and then have them do a collaborative task and see what will work.
Yes, I totally agree. 3 answers to that question. One is that we do need to look across communities. That's why we started looking across kind of thousands of different wikis. Number 2, there is something we can do even without experimental observation. We should be doing more things that give us more causal power, like panel designs using instrumental variables, etc., that give us kind of better control over analyses. Number 3, yes, exactly. We need to do more experimental things, and we need to do them at a larger scale. So a thing that I can't talk about in detail today is we've spent the last 2 years actually building a framework to do exactly that, what you're suggesting. What we do is we actually bring in people from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which I will now talk about, and we bring them together in small groups where we can control things like who's the leader of the group? How many people are in the group? What's the turnover in the group? What are the policies by which they work at? And by recruiting, we can do essentially massively scaled social science experiments, right? Where you can now replicate this across lots of different groups and control it experimentally. So it turns out it's harder to do that than you might think, which is why we spent kind of years working on this. But we finally do seem to have something, and I'll give you some hints as to kind of how we got there too. Good, so thank you for the introduction into the next section here. So now I'm going to talk, I've talked about Wikipedia a lot. I'm going to talk about crowdsourcing a little bit more generally in the sense of crowdsourcing complex work. Now, crowdsourcing has been a tremendously powerful paradigm for very simple tasks like NASA click workers, where people circle images of craters on Mars' surface. And by aggregating hundreds of thousands of these volunteers, you can get results that are indistinguishable from expert geologists. Another example is eBird from Cornell, where amateur bird watchers actually take their sightings of birds and report them on eBird. And by collecting over 4 million bird observations a year, they can find very interesting patterns that they wouldn't have been able to find otherwise. For example, bi-yearly kind of eruptions of bird populations, where they just didn't have the data for before, right? Another one, which I'll be talking about, is Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is a general purpose marketplace for tasks to be done by people, right? So a typical task would be something like this. Here's an image. Find all of the text in this image and write what the text is. That's all you have to do, okay? It'll take you a few seconds to do that, and you would get paid, say, 2 cents for doing that. And this is very typical of a lot of the types of tasks that are on Mechanical Turk. Short tasks that are hard for computers but easy for people, that are independent, and that can be easily aggregated, right? And so that should kind of cue you into the fact that I'm interested in how do we take this work, which is being done, kind of these very simple tasks. They're very short. They require no expertise, and they're kind of embarrassingly parallel. But there's a lot of kinds of work that that aren't like that, right? So writing an article, producing software, scientific discovery. I'll actually talk about translating a poem. These aren't things that lend themselves to kind of simple independent judgments automatically aggregated. And how do we support these kinds of complex, creative, interdependent tasks with task markets where people are just doing a little bit of work for you and you don't know very much about them? So the first thing I'm going to tell you about is actually poetry translation. So poetry translation is actually an interesting task to study because it's really, really hard. It's very subjective, ambiguous. You have to be very creative. You have to use it's very high cognitive effort. It's very difficult to break up the poem. You want it to kind of flow and to have a similar rhythm and a similar theme throughout, right? And these things make it actually exactly the kind of task that you would not want to use Mechanical Turk on, right?
What is poetry translation?
So you have a poem in, say, Spanish, and you want to translate it to English. Yeah, thanks. And you want to kind of keep the concept of the poem. You want to keep the, the art of the poem. And so what I'm going to do now is, so we tried this, right? So I'll preface this by saying we didn't expect all that much, but what we want to see is, if we try this task, at least we'll learn something about what do we need to do for these markets? What kinds of tools and software and coordination structures do we need to allow these people to be more creative together and to be working on more complex tasks? Okay, so now I'm going to give you 2 translations. Okay, this is a poem by Garcia Lorcas, who's a very famous Spanish poet on the left. One of these translations is the crowdsourced translation that we did on Mechanical Turk. The other one is, I won't tell you which is which, the other one is a professional translation that was published in a book of kind of Spanish poetry. So what I want you to do is decide which of these is a better poem, and also for the other one, how much worse is it? Like, is it at least reasonable? All right, so take a minute to look at. Okay, so who thinks that translation 1 is a better translation? And who thinks that translation 2 is a better translation? Okay, so probably about 3/4 of the people thought translation 2. For someone who preferred translation 2, can you say why?
More poetic.
All right. Thank you. So it turns out that actually translation 2 is the crowdsourced translation. And translation 1 was actually from a published anthology of poems.
But was that multiple people or by one person?
I'll show you exactly how we did that.
Was the translation in the anthology of poems actually done by a professional poetry
By a
translator?
professional poetry translator.
Okay. And how good was the guy actually?
Well, let me show you how, I'm this
first and last job.
Well, the book was published.
Did it sell?
I don't know.
What was he yeah.
So let me tell you a little bit about how we did this, right? I mean, forget how good the other one was. That you all, 3/4 of you thought at least that this one was in some sense more poetic. It had some of those qualities to it. And one of the ways that we did this in particular was that we broke this barrier of independence that all of these Turkers have. Normally these Turkers are doing independent tasks. They don't know about each other. But we know from kind of a lot of work that there are advantages of when people work together. So you can coordinate things on the fly, right? If I see you're working on this part, I can go work on this part. We can change what we do by seeing what each other are doing. There are motivational gains, right? If I know you're working with me, there's interpersonal bonds that we might have. We might feel like we're part of a group together, and that might motivate us more. You might see kind of helping behavior or kind of citizenship behaviors by being part of the group that you would do for the group, but maybe not for someone outside of the group. And kind of you can work on what pieces you want to work on, right? And this is sort of part of coordination. And maybe you would work on pieces that you find more interesting or closer to your expertise. So how we did this was we actually, so the other thing is, these are nice things, but would they actually work in a task market where everything is really driven financially, and these people have never kind of interacted with each other before? Yeah?
I'm not sure the right point to interject this question, but I wonder also simplicity. Like there's a poetry versus simplicity. What may be appealing is like a flower. Remember flowering lilies versus spikenard, which I guess is a kind of flower. There's something kind of more poetic and evocative maybe about the spikenard, although I like the flowering lilies because I get it quicker. And I'm wondering if that simplicity factor, by crowdsourcing, you develop a certain simplicity that more people can understand what's going on. One other quick one, rotation versus sway. Sway doesn't make sense for the moon. Rotation does, but sway is more poetic than rotation.
but you understand notation and it actually fits there. So the simplicity.
Yeah, so I'm not going to make the case that the crowd is going to be kind of take over the role of poets and like really creative people, right? Because I think there is probably something to what you're saying. When you do have a crowd, you may get something that is closer to the middle than to the outside, but I'm not convinced of that. So I think it's an empirical question.
I'm not saying it's worse. I'm just saying I'm wondering myself that the spike in art is subjective, but the spike in art or the flowering lilies is better, right? But it's also the beach. I'm not sure myself.
Right. So involving ourselves as both producers and audience, maybe there's a match there, and yeah, maybe that's So I don't know. Maybe that's a good question. Yeah.
I would sure want to see the history of translation 2 of the Garcia Lorca poem. History in the same sense in which you have history of wiki articles. There might have been one brilliant editor who did the original thing and then coordinated, and everybody else just gasped at the artistic quality.
So let's look at that exactly. So what we did was we used Etherpad, which is an open source software system. Think of it as a real-time Google Docs, where every single keystroke that you type is shown to everyone else and shown in a separate color for each individual. Okay, and so let me just I'll actually show you the history right now. And the nice thing is that you can play this back. So here's the poem on the left, and I'm going to just play back the history. And remember, each person is in a different color. Let me try to make this a little bigger. So you can see one person is actually doing a lot of the work here. So far, this is actually supporting your theory, right? But we see this pattern a lot. The first person adds a lot of content. But now you see that people are coming in, right? Here's the air moved. Whoa, the affected air, right? So no one is really happy with this yet. The emotioned air. We're getting closer. The shaken air. I don't know about that one. The quivering air. Okay, that's pretty good. And so you can see that it really is kind of a lot of different people who are editing this poem. And by allowing these people, by treating these people as humans, right? By treating these people as intelligent processors who can interact with each other, we seem to be getting some relatively good results here. Now, it's not just about, how do we switch back? Okay, so it's not just about them kind of editing in here and seeing each other's work, which I think is quite useful. We also saw some really interesting patterns where people were actually talking to each other. So Etherpad supports kind of a chat pane on the side, and people were we weren't paying them to do this, but they were chatting with each other. So they were saying, oh, should it really be kind of tin or pewter? Probably, this gets to your point. People may not know what spikenard art is, so let's use Lily because we're going to have kind of an English audience here, right? So we see a lot of interesting communication behaviors going on. And we also see that by doing this, by breaking the independence barrier, we can get people who find this to be fun, right? So this was fun. We had someone who, after the fact, said, oh, my edits didn't get put into the poem. You already paid me, but I just really wanted to give you these edits, right? Because, and furthermore, after we finished with the experiment, someone went into the pad, replaced the poem with another poem by Pablo Neruda, and other people came in and edited and translated that poem, right? For no gain whatsoever. Okay, so this kind of highlights the fact that if we break the, if there are ways of organizing these Turkers so that they're not just doing small and simple tasks, so that we can tap into things like creativity. Let me show you another example really quickly. Yeah.
Your task for these Turkers was, we'll pay you a nickel to go to Etherpad and do whatever you can do.
We mess with it's very important what you say to them. What we said was to go and either translate or improve at least kind of some small chunk of translation that was there. Yeah. Yeah, we can talk about that more. Okay, so let me tell you about kind of one last thing here. Now, what I just showed you is kind of self-selection of people working on whatever they want. They could come and not do anything. They could have all just translated the first stanza, and none of them translated the second stanza. Now we're screwed. So how do we crowdsource complex interdependent tasks where we need the work to be done, right? So think about writing that Stanford University page. We want, HCI to be in there, right? So let's make sure that it's in there. There are some problems with this. One is that there are a lot of different tasks that are involved. You have to plan the article, you need to organize it. There are all these different things that need to be done in a particular order, and each worker only has a tiny amount that they're going to contribute. So if you want someone to do that whole task, you're going to have to pay them a lot more. For some tasks, by the time they finish reading, they've already used up their time, right? So imagine it this way. If all of us wanted to write that article about Stanford University, and we each had 1 minute to contribute our efforts, right? How would you organize something like that? Like, that's not trivial, right? So what we did was we actually took some ideas kind of inspired by principles from distributed machine computing to apply to distributed human collaboration, and kind of inspired by this idea that, yeah, maybe there's some small set of components that we could use to combine together into flows that would allow us to manage this kind of article process. So let me give you kind of the intuition of it here. So let's say we wanted to write an article about New York City, right? So what we would do is we would actually take some Turkers and say, okay, just come up with a partition, right? What should this article have in terms of the different sections, right? And then we would take those and we would have other Turkers go. And remember, these Turkers are only doing, like a minute's worth of work, right? So you can't even ask them to write that whole section. That's too much. So we would just ask, you take each of those sections and you kind of map that out and you say, okay, go and find a single fact that's relevant to this section, right? And you get a whole bunch of those facts for a particular section. And now you reduce those so that you have someone take those facts and write a paragraph from that. So no one has to know all that much. No one has to do all that much. But by assembling all of these small slices of people's time and effort, we can come up with a much more complex artifact. And so we did this, and we also we paid people the same amount that we paid the entire group to write the article, and they don't have to deal with any of these coordination issues and assembling and recombining and all of that. And it turns out that the group written articles were rated higher than the individual written articles with lower variance, and just as good as simple Wikipedia articles on the same topic, right? Yeah?
This seems to contradict your concentration result, in the sense that there's nobody who's concentrating. There's nobody doing work a minute.
Well, maybe we would have done even better. So that's one thing that we want to look at, actually. Good point. Yeah?
Well, maybe to argue with Phil, in a way, you set a framework, right, of how workers will split divided work and merge at the end. So there is one concentrator, which is the person who is supposed to devises the whole structure at the end. And so can you maybe speculate? It seems like some of the structure that the workers come up with.
Yeah.
Other parts of the structure you just preordain.
Right.
And where do you draw that line?
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question, right? And, well, as you know, a very empirical question, right? So there are kind of people who are working on can you split tasks up themselves, some of the stuff that you or Matt and Anand are doing, and kind of Rob Miller, et cetera. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how far we can push it. I think so let me just kind of suggest that, yeah, maybe you can do something much more complex, and the workers can be deciding at at various points, should this happen or should it not happen? So yeah, I don't know. I think there's kind of two questions here. One is how much can the workers define the flow itself? And the second is kind of how well do these different flows work and how effective are they? And so I think both of those questions need to be answered. Yeah.
It counters your concentration argument. I think it supports your deeper assertion that the structure, the coordinating structure, enables higher quality.
Right. So yeah, exactly, and thanks for both of you for bringing that up. I think in some sense the system is playing the role of the concentrated coordinator. But I think there's also kind of, to speculate more, there's also opportunity for what if there's kind of an intelligent person behind there who could adapt to this on the fly, or we could kind of give someone a bunch of money and say, okay, we're outsourcing this to you. You manage this process, right? So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there might be some kind of interesting combination of things there. About $3.50.
So Nikki will be around. So whatever time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.